John Hughes, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most prolific screenwriters that I know of, responsible for some of my favorite movies growing up, and definitely labeled by many folks as the voice of a generation, that generation being around the 1980s, early 1990s. And I've always been a fan of his, like I mentioned, definitely from a writing perspective, put him up there on a pedestal of goals I would like to target and achieve, and maybe not even achieve, but just to strive for one day. That level of prolific, and not necessarily within screenplays and movie making necessarily, or exclusively rather, but just from a writing perspective in general. And I definitely do want to take some of my short stories, definitely novels, and write screenplay versions of them. That's definitely on my bucket list. But in terms of being as prolific as a John Hughes, that's just more of a gold star standard type of thing, right? Like a kid loving basketball and wanting to be the next Kobe Bryant or something like that. But I digress. These are just some of the movies that he's written: Mr. Mom, National Lampoon's Vacation, 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, banger, Weird Science, banger, Pretty in Pink, banger, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, banger, just fucking hit after hit after hit. Some Kind of Wonderful, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Uncle Buck, and I'm skipping movies here, like through his IMDb, by the way. This is how prolific this guy is. Home Alone, yes, that Home Alone, Macaulay Culkin Home Alone, Curly Sue, the Beethoven movies. It's insane, his level of output. Dennis the Menace. And it's not like these movies came out in 83, 84, multiple movies in 83, multiple movies in 84, multiple movies in 1985, multiple movies in 1986, multiple movies in 1987, 1988, 1989, 1990, 91. His level of output is, I'm just in awe of it. It's insane. And I could be naive to the fact, but I literally don't know of anyone else with that type of track record in terms of screenwriting and just classic after classic after classic after classic. He literally was like that voice of a generation. But anyway, a big fan, obviously, but didn't know much about him. I knew he died young, which I'll get to. And I knew he was responsible for writing and in some cases even directing a lot of these movies, but didn't know much about his approach to his craft or his backstory, etc. And I started looking things up online and stumbled upon a couple of half-hour, not montages, but like excerpts from other documentaries that have been made on him, and I couldn't find the actual documentary to attribute it to, but it was just someone that like ripped different excerpts from a specific documentary and made 2 half-hour chunks, so an hour's worth of material, both of which I linked to in the episode notes if you guys want to check them out yourselves. The titles are John Hughes, The Voice of a Generation, and Heartbreak and Triumph, The Legacy of John Hughes. But from those, I wanted to share a few things that definitely resonated with me. In terms of a writing style, this one definitely hit home because it's the way that when I write a short story or am working on a novel, this is pretty much my process. And he said that he thinks about an idea for a long time and he knows how it's going to go and who the characters are, because again, he's like constantly thinking about ideas in the back of his head. So he said the writing part itself isn't hard because it's like as he's writing, he's seeing the movie in his head because he's, molded over so much. So he feels like he's seeing the movie in his head as he writes. And it's just like watching a movie very slowly and being able to change aspects of the movie in real time. And that's definitely similar to my writing process. So it was comforting to hear from someone on his level. Because there are, at least for me, and I know it's the same for other creatives, it's definitely not a unique thought here, but speaking for me specifically, there's always a level of insecurity when you're doing something creative. You're putting something together, you don't know if you're doing it quote unquote right, whatever that means. Is there a traditional process that should be followed here? What rules am I breaking? What rules should I be breaking? What rules should I not be breaking rather? What are the rules? Are people going to like this? Is it going to resonate? All those types of insecure written thoughts are within the act of creating, in my opinion. It takes a certain amount of vulnerability to put yourself out there like that, to put your creative work out there like that. And it's just, you never know, right? So that was definitely comforting to see that his process was similar to mine, at least in that respect. Also, he worked in advertising. He had a copy editing job and didn't start pursuing writing screenplays and movies until he was 30 years old. That's when he literally left the corporate world and started pursuing his dream, which I thought was pretty cool. And probably in retrospect, and this part is just speculation, but that probably fueled, at least in part, how prolific he was. You know, maybe he had a sense of, I have to catch up. You know, I haven't been writing for as long as these other writers in the industry that have just done this. I've, had a whole different life and career for 30 years, or until the age of 30 rather. So I got to step up my grind that much more to make up for lost time. Again, I'm speculating that piece, but wouldn't be surprised if that was the case there. He also said in these documentary clips that he reads dialogue out loud, which is definitely a tip that I would recommend. Something, again, that I do that I've gotten from other writers and writing tips. This next piece that he shared is something that I have attempted to do and have done, but very, very surface level, specific to my novel FRACTAL, and also in this other novel that I never put out and never completed it, actually. Plan to circle back to it sometime in the future. I don't think I've ever even spoken about it here. But it's a story based in India that I started writing as a short story while I was in India. And it's just like one of those manuscripts that you start and never finish. But in that one, I attempted this as well, which was the character building. And what I did in that book, and also did in FRACTAL, which for those of you who may not know is my science fiction time travel novel, available now, spuntoday.com/books, if you want to check it out. But what you do is create a character card, which Scrivener as a writing tool has like templates for this, which is a great base to like start off with, and you can add and tweak whatever you want within it. But you have a character card for your character. You have their full name in there. Whether you ever mention their full name in the story or not is completely secondary. You have their age, you have their likes, you have their characteristics. How much do they weigh? How tall are they? What color are their eyes? What are their interests? What are a few likes of theirs? What are a few habits of theirs? What are dislikes of theirs? Pet peeves? Like things like that. Like you build up the character as like an actual person, and you let all of that inform their dialogue or how they carry themselves and essentially them throughout the story. But you don't necessarily in the story have to say Hector's character is 5'9" and works out at the gym 3 days a week, and he eats fairly lean, and he's had this habit since his dad died 8 years ago, etc., etc. Like you can have all that type of stuff in your character card, but how that translates in the actual story that you write is just that, Hector's a fit guy, but you might not know those things, but it is part of what motivates that character, his tendencies, etc. Anyway, so I've done that type like surface level character building. But John Hughes apparently did this at a much higher level with his characters and his stories, which is why a lot of the characters in his stories resonated so much with us. Because movies weren't really these elaborate plots. They were really character driven, and they had usually kind of like a moral takeaway within them. But I'll give you two examples from the story in terms of his character building. Leah Thompson, in one of her roles, which I believe was from Some Kind of Wonderful, where she played Amanda Jones, she said that in the middle of her shooting, John Hughes went up to her to check her purse, the purse that she was wearing on set, and opened it to make sure that it wasn't just full of tissue paper. And to her credit, it wasn't. It was filled with things that her character, Amanda Jones, would use, like the type of lipstick she used, whatever she carried in her purse. And like that's one level of character building, making sure that the unseen things actually exist. And that gives that level of complexity and that layer to that character. Even something as trivial as what's in someone's purse. Another great example of that was Alan Ruck's character, Cameron Fry, from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which, by the way, this is one of the ones that John Hughes not only wrote, but he also directed it. We know from the movie that Cameron's father was like this cold, absent father figure, and his house was kind of like a museum. everything in the house had to be in absolute pristine condition or his dad would like flip out. And what John Hughes told Alan Ruck about his character, again, from this character building exercise, from John Hughes actually writing the character, is that Cameron's dad was the type of person that made sure that every single screw in all the hinges of all the doors of the house lined up perfectly straight and everything was pristine, right? We gleaned that much from what we did get from the movie. What we didn't know is that Cameron had a great relationship with his grandfather. His grandfather was really like the male figure in his life since his father was so absent and so cold. And his grandfather lived in Detroit and used to take Cameron to hockey games all the time. And he had this great bond with his grandfather. And that's why Cameron is wearing like that Flyers Detroit hockey jersey in most of the movie. And that piece is all backstory, which again informs Cameron as the character, but that we don't know about. It gives his character that richness and layers that make him that much more believable to us as the viewer. And that's definitely a practice that I want to hone in more on within my writing. Another thing they touched on was that he preferred working alone, as I think most of us writers do. And creatives in general, I feel like, are protective of what it is that they do. So much so that even for me, my first couple books have not been professionally edited. I try to like self-teach myself certain editing by listening to podcasts of editors. Shout out to Sean Coyne and the Story Grid podcast. By leveraging editing tools like Pro Writing Aid, etc. Because even the thought of someone influencing what's written on the paper, I pull back from a bit, right? But objectively, being cognizant of the fact that my next book is being professionally edited, and I'm definitely going to give you guys an update on how that process is going during the next free writing session episode of this podcast. But understanding that all professional writers at that top tier go through multiple professional edits. And there are developmental edits, line edits, proofreading, etc., etc. And what I'm learning, and again, this is within, like the book writing world, what I'm learning so far in my nascent stages of the writing editing process is that a good editor is not going to, or let me take that back, not necessarily a good quote unquote editor, because I'm not making that type of judgment or determination, but the right editor for you as a writer is someone that's going to help navigate and elevate your words and your work and polish them, as opposed to trying to change your manuscript into something that it's not. And that's core to their role in the editing process. But circling back to John Hughes, he had this aversion to writing by committee. And he admitted he was spoiled a bit because he went from, that corporate gig that he had to writing for National Lampoon magazine, where he had complete freedom, and the editor, which was in the documentary, pretty much gave him like free reign, write whatever, however, and whatever stories you want to write about, because he thought so highly of John Hughes' writing. To then go from that to putting out these banger movies, but then starting to generate the corporate backing and interest and stuff like that to put these films out, where he puts the work in to build up these characters in the ways that I outlined earlier in terms of character building, etc., and create these really rich, deep, believable characters and stories that resonate, to then be in a boardroom of 30 executives that don't know about writing, let alone the backstories to each and every one of his characters, and have them say, oh no, but wouldn't it be cooler if you rode a motorcycle instead of that car? Meanwhile, the backstory to that car is something that John Hughes knows that character drives because it reminds him of his father and the car that his dad gave him when he was 16, or like something like that, you know what I mean? But the exec is just looking at it from the angle of, oh no, but put him in a motorcycle instead, because motorcycles are in now and it might help us sell more tickets. So he hated and struggled a lot with that aspect of the whole Hollywood machine. That again is definitely something that resonated and that I found interesting there. Another cool story related to Ferris Bueller, he was hanging out with one of his directors. I believe it was the gentleman who directed Pretty in Pink, or one of the Molly Ringwald movies. but they were like polishing up a script that they were going to be working on together. And the guy wound up like sleeping over, and John Hughes pretty much like stayed up all night, as he was like known for doing. And the next morning handed his director buddy like 50 pages. And the guy was like, 50 pages? How the heck did you write 50 pages? We were just supposed to write like work on 3 or 4. And John Hughes' response was, oh, actually didn't even get to those. These are like 50 pages on something else that I wrote that I'm not even sure what it is yet, really, but here, give it a read. Let me know what you think. And he gave it to him. And that was the first 50 pages of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Literally one of his most iconic movies, written in one night. And he was like known for that. Again, being so prolific, putting out so many movies. As I mentioned earlier, multiple bangers within the same year. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I saw a clip from an interview with Steve Martin saying that John Hughes wrote that in like 3 or 4 days, the entire script. Insane. But yeah, ultimately he wound up leaving Hollywood because, again, of the aforementioned not being able to like cope with that stress or like friction that he was feeling with having to navigate the Hollywood machine with all of these like execs in the way. And he bought, the story goes, he bought several acres worth of land outside of Chicago. Chicago is where he's from, by the way. Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like all the high school shots and a lot of the shots of, I believe, The Breakfast Club as well, were shot at his actual high school that he went to in Chicago. Just a little fun fact for you. But anyway, he wound up buying a bunch of acres of land outside of Chicago and apparently did some like farming and raising animals. And according to that same director buddy of his, definitely continued writing, kept a journal all those years, and continued writing screenplays that, you know, he never put out, and books as well, which would be amazing if any of that ever got uncovered, right? But it was just his creative outlet, you know, he needed to continue writing. And unfortunately, he wound up dying at the age of 59, super young. He was visiting his son in Manhattan, who had just had a baby, his new grandchild, John Hughes' new grandchild. And he was walking in Manhattan and literally just had a heart attack and dropped and died. And he was survived by his wife of 39 years, which he married his high school sweetheart. They were married at 19, 20 years old. And he had 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. And that's my little recap and review of John Hughes. Round of applause for such a prolific, amazing writer who is definitely a North Star of mine. And again, I'll link to those documentary excerpts in the episode notes for you guys to check out.